There are 34 bones in each superior limb. These include 2 flat bones, 22 long bones, 8 short bones, and 2 sesamoid bones. These are named the scapula and clavicle, humerus, radius, ulna, 5 metacarpal bones, 14 phalanges, 8 carpal bones, and 2 sesamoid bones at the base of the thumb. The first bone is the clavicle, and it has 4 named landmarks. The body of the clavicle is what extends through the length of the bone. The sternal extremity of the clavicle is what articulates with the sternum. The acromial extremity of the clavicle is what articulates with the acromion of the scapula. And then just underneath there's a little projection posterior to the body and inferior to the body, termed the conoid tubercle of the clavicle. The next bone is the scapula, also known on the street as the shoulder blade. It has an anterior surface or costal surface, hence the name because it butts up against the ribs, and a posterior surface. On the anterior surface of the scapula is the subscapular fossa, which is pretty much a depression that makes up the whole of the anterior surface of the scapula. As well, on the anterior surface of the scapula is the coracoid process of the scapula, which is this bony projection right here, and just medial to that is a little notch known as the scapular notch. The posterior surface of the scapula is where the rest of the landmarks are found. The spine of the scapula is what makes up this long ridge running from lateral to medial, and just above it is the supraspinous fossa of the scapula, supra meaning above, and infraspinous scapula, infra meaning below. So the spine of the scapula, the supraspinous fossa of the scapula, and infraspinous fossa of the scapula. The scapula also has 3 borders and 3 angles that are similarly named. It has a superior border of the scapula, a lateral border of the scapula, and a medial border of the scapula. And then it has a superior angle of the scapula, inferior angle of the scapula, and lateral angle of the scapula. And the lateral angle of the scapula, it's sometimes confusing to students because the superior and inferior angle definitely tapers to more of a point, whereas the lateral, not much so. But it's extrapolated from the direction that we're traveling. So this lateralmost portion of the scapula is the lateral angle of the scapula. And then the scapula doesn't have a head, but it does have a neck, which is this more narrow portion. So this is the neck of the scapula. What articulates with the head of the humerus is the glenoid cavity of the scapula, which you can actually see a little bit better from the anterior view here. So this is the glenoid cavity of the scapula. The next bone is the humerus, which is this bone right up here. It makes up your arm or brachium and has several landmarks. The first is the head of the humerus, which is this round ball. This is the ball and socket joint, and the head of the humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula to form the shoulder joint. So this is the head of the humerus. Along its circumference is this little ridge, and this is the anatomic neck of the humerus. Okay, also on the anterior surface are 2 projections off of the head of the humerus. The larger of the 2 is the greater tubercle of the humerus, and the smaller is the lesser tubercle of the humerus. And then in between them is this little groove called the intertubercular groove of the humerus, because it goes between the 2 tubercles. Intertubercular groove of the humerus. As you move distally, there's a little slight projection about halfway down the diaphysis, and this is the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. It's actually where the deltoid muscle attaches to the humerus. So deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. As we continue to move distally, on the lateral aspect is a bony ridge, and this ridge on the lateral aspect is called the lateral supracondylar crest of the humerus. So if we break that down, it's lateral on the lateral side, supra meaning above, and condylar, this is actually, we'll learn this in a second, but this is the humeral condyle. So the lateral supracondylar crest of the humerus. So it's lateral and it's above the condyle. So this whole portion down here is the humeral condyle, and it actually consists of 2 parts. This rounded portion is known as the capitulum, And this other portion that looks more like a pulley is the trochlea. And correct terminology has these parented to the humeral condyle. So we would say this whole structure is the condyle of the humerus, and this little portion is the capitulum of the humeral condyle, and this is the trochlea of the humeral condyle. Lateral, this is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and on the other side, this other projection coming off is the medial epicondyle of the humerus. And also on the anterior aspect, we see two depressions. This one right above or superior to the capitulum of the humeral condyle is the radial fossa, and the one just medial to it is the coronoid fossa. The coronoid fossa, if we flex this elbow joint, you can see the coronoid process of the ulna fits right into that coronoid fossa, as well as the head of the radius fits into that radial fossa. So when you're actually turning your arm like this, the head of the radius is what is articulating with that radial fossa. On the posterior aspect of the humerus is one more depression. This is the olecranon fossa of the humerus, and the olecranon of the ulna is what fits right into that when the elbow joint is extended. Moving down to the forearm, or the antebrachium, the first bone that we have is the radius, and it's going to be lateral of the two bones in the forearm. This is the radius. It has a head of the radius, which is what articulates with the capitulum of the humeral condyle. It has a neck of the radius, which is this tapered portion right here. And it has an articular circumference, which is this rim of the head of the radius right here. This projection off the anterior aspect is the radial tuberosity. And then if we go medial, just as it butts up against this ulna, it actually forms a little ridge, which is known as the interosseous border of the radius. On the distal end of the radius, where it articulates with the carpal bones, on this distal end inferior, it has a little shallow depression, and this is called the carpal articular surface of the radius. Also, just lateral to it is a projection termed the styloid process of the radius, almost like a pen because it comes to a point. So the styloid process of the radius. And then where it articulates with the head of the ulna, there's an ulnar notch of the radius. Backtracking to the ulna, the portion that articulates with the coronoid fossa of the humerus is the coronoid process of the ulna. And then posteriorly, we have the olecranon of the ulna. Where the ulna articulates with the radius is a radial notch of the ulna, which articulates with the head of the radius. And then further down, on the distal end, there is the head of the ulna down here, and there's also a styloid process coming off the back, the styloid process of the ulna. And then just like the radius, we have an interosseous border of the ulna. The last component of the bones of the superior limb are the bones in the hand. The first thing is there are 8 carpal bones that make up the wrist. The first, which articulates with the carpal articular surface of the radius, is known as the scaphoid bone. Right medial to it is the lunate bone, and even though it's hard to see in this model, this little portion that I'm pointing to is actually 2 different bones. You have the triquetral bone, which is more deep, and more superficial, you have a little rounded bone called the pisiform bone. Moving back laterally, there's the hamate bone with this little hook called the hamulus of the hamate bone. And then this next is the capitate bone, the trapezoid bone, and the trapezium bone. So a few things to remember. A useful mnemonic that I learned was, so long the pinky, here comes the thumb. And that's useful because we have scaphoid bone, so long, lunate bone, the triquetral, pisiform bone, pinky, here, hamate bone with the hamulus of the hamate bone, comes capitate bone, the trapezoid, and trapezium, thumb. So remember there's an M in trapezium if you get these confused. Trapezium goes to the thumb, and trapezoid doesn't have an M, so it doesn't go to the thumb. Scaphoid bone, lunate bone, triquetral bone, pisiform bone, hamate bone, the hamulus of the hamate bone, capitate bone, trapezoid bone, and trapezium. The 5 metacarpals are what is in between the carpal bones and the 14 phalanges. And they're all just named by designation by number, starting with the most lateral. So this is the first metacarpal bone, second metacarpal bone, third metacarpal bone, fourth and fifth metacarpal bones. And the landmarks on the metacarpal bones, each metacarpal bone has a base, a body, and a head. So this landmark would be the base of the third metacarpal bone. This would be the head of the fourth metacarpal bone, and so forth. And then the 14 phalanges also have a base, a body, and a head, and are designated as proximal and distal. So the thumb has just a proximal and distal, whereas digits 2 through 5 have a proximal, middle, and distal phalanx. So there's a base, a body, and a head. And then each distal phalanx ends in a terminally widened process termed the tuberosity of the distal phalanx. So you'd say the tuberosity of the distal phalanx of the third digit, for example, for this landmark, or the distal the tuberosity of a distal phalanx of the fifth digit, for example, on that landmark. And that's it. That's all the bones in the superior limb.